The dragon orphanage wasn't supposed to be this cold. It sat at the northern edge of the capital's outer ring, a stone fortress built decades ago when dragon populations were declining and political tensions ran high. Officially, it was called the Emberlight Sanctuary for Displaced Hatchlings. Unofficially, everyone just called it the Cold Keep. Not because of its architecture, because no one important cared what happened inside. I arrived on a transport convoy during the worst winter in 30 years. The sky was iron gray, the wind sharp enough to cut exposed skin, and frost clung to the orphanage's towers like creeping ivy. I wasn't there as a hero. I was there on contract. My name is Daniel Mercer, systems engineer, thermal infrastructure specialist. I fixed failing heating grids in remote settlements. When the Capital Council flagged Emberlight's core furnace as non-essential maintenance, my firm passed the assignment to me because no one else wanted to freeze for a week troubleshooting ancient dragon-built systems. The moment I stepped inside, I knew the report had lied. It wasn't just a faulty furnace. It was systemic failure. The main hall ceiling arched high overhead, built to accommodate adolescent wing growth. Frost coated the stone pillars. Braziers that should have been blazing were barely smoldering. And along the walls, in nests carved from rock and padded with worn fabric, dozens of dragon hatchlings huddled together for warmth. They were too quiet. That's what hit me first. Dragon hatchlings are not silent creatures. They chirp, snap, argue, test their breath abilities. These little ones barely moved. A caretaker hurried toward me. A middle-aged woman wrapped in 3 layers of wool, exhaustion lining her face. "You're the engineer?" she asked, hope and skepticism mixed together. "That depends," I said lightly. "Do you have a heating system that hasn't been updated since the previous century?" She didn't smile. "It failed 3 nights ago. Backup braziers aren't enough. The younger ones can't regulate their cores in temperatures this low." I glanced at a nearby nest. 2 tiny red-scaled hatchlings were curled together, embers beneath their scales flickering weakly. Beside them, a pale silver hatchling trembled, frost forming unevenly across her back, her internal cold core destabilizing from the environment instead of harmonizing with it. "How many?" I asked quietly. 42, she replied. "Ages ranging from newly hatched to first-flight adolescents." 42. 42 living furnaces, ice forges, storm hearts. And they were freezing. "Show me the furnace," I said. The thermal core chamber lay beneath the orphanage, a massive cylindrical relic of old dragon-human collaboration engineering. It ran on a hybrid system. Geothermal taps channeled into scale-reactive conduits designed to distribute balanced heat across stone ducts. At least that was the theory. In reality, half the conduits were cracked. The geothermal intake valve was jammed with mineral buildup, and the central distribution array had been patched so many times it looked like metal lacework. "When was the last full overhaul?" I asked. The caretaker hesitated. 23 years. I closed my eyes briefly. Why wasn't this prioritized? She gave a hollow laugh. "Because orphan dragons don't vote." Of course they didn't. I rolled up my sleeves. "All right," I muttered. "Let's see what we can salvage." For 12 hours straight I worked. I cleared mineral deposits from intake pipes, rewired fractured conduits, replaced cracked seals with industrial polymer from my kit. By midnight, the geothermal feed stabilized. But when I activated the distribution array, nothing. The heat reached the central chamber and stalled. I stared at the readings. The system wasn't just broken. It was undersized. The orphanage had grown over the decades. More hatchlings, expanded wings, additional nesting halls, but the original furnace core had never been upgraded to compensate. Even fully repaired, it couldn't produce enough balanced thermal output to warm the entire structure. I climbed back upstairs. The hatchlings were quieter now. Too quiet. One small obsidian-scaled dragon, barely larger than a house cat, watched me from his nest. His golden eyes tracked every movement as if calculating whether I was a solution or another disappointment. I crouched beside him. "What's your name?" I asked softly. He didn't respond verbally, but a faint curl of smoke escaped his nostrils. "Fair," I nodded. I don't introduce myself to strangers either. He shivered. That decided it. I stood and turned to the caretaker. The furnace can't handle the load, I said bluntly. Even at full capacity, you'll lose heat faster than it distributes. Her face fell. So we move them? She whispered. There's no other facility equipped for this many. No, I said slowly, thinking. I walked to the center of the hall, studying the architecture. The ceilings were high for flight practice. The walls thick stone. Beneath us, stable geothermal veins. Dragon architecture wasn't designed like human housing. It was meant to amplify internal cores. An idea sparked. Where do they practice breath control? I asked suddenly. She blinked. In the training atrium. But it's been closed due to cold. Open it. She hesitated, but gestured toward a large double-door chamber. Inside, the atrium was circular, walls lined with scale-reactive crystal panels designed to absorb and redistribute energy during training sessions. I stepped into the center and turned slowly. This wasn't just a practice room. It was a capacitor. What if, I murmured, the solution isn't making more heat, but teaching the building to store theirs? The caretaker stared at me. Explain. These panels, I said, running my hand along one crystalline surface, were built to absorb excess breath output so hatchlings don't scorch the walls. But absorption works both ways. If we rewire the furnace to feed into this chamber as a central reservoir, combine geothermal baseline heat with controlled hatchling output, we can create a self-sustaining thermal loop. She looked toward the doorway where several older hatchlings were watching curiously. You want the children to power the orphanage? I want to give them a system that works with them, I corrected gently. Not despite them. Silence hung heavy. Then, from the doorway, the tiny obsidian hatchling padded forward. He stepped into the atrium cautiously, looked at me, then released the smallest, weakest puff of flame I'd ever seen. It hit the crystal panel, and instead of dispersing, the panel glowed. Softly, warmly. The heat didn't vanish. It lingered, stored. I felt my pulse quicken. This place was never meant to rely on one furnace, I said quietly. It was meant to be alive. The caretaker's eyes filled with something dangerously close to hope. Outside, wind howled against frozen stone. Inside the atrium, one small crystal panel glowed faintly red in the darkness. It wasn't enough. Not yet. But it was a beginning. And for the first time since I'd arrived, the cold keep didn't feel entirely hopeless. The next morning, the atrium was no longer abandoned. It was alive. Word had spread through the orphanage faster than any official announcement. Hatchlings who had barely stirred from their nests the day before were now gathered at the circular chamber doors, whispering in chirps and soft growls. Frost-coated claws tapped against stone floors. Tiny wings fluttered nervously. They were curious. That was good. Curiosity meant energy. I stood in the center of the atrium beside the caretaker. Her name, I'd learned, was Mara. She had raised more dragon children than most generals had commanded soldiers. "You're sure about this?" she asked quietly. "No," I replied honestly. "But I'm sure the old system won't save them." Below the atrium, I had spent the entire night rerouting the furnace output. Instead of pushing raw geothermal heat directly into the failing ducts, I redirected it upward into the crystal-lined walls of the training chamber. The idea was simple in theory and dangerous in execution. Create a thermal battery. Geothermal heat would provide baseline warmth. Hatchling breath, fire, frost, lightning, even acidic vapor in small quantities, would be absorbed and harmonized by the crystalline panels. Once saturated, the chamber would redistribute balanced heat through the orphanage via convection channels carved into the stone foundation. If it worked, the building would become self-sustaining. If it failed, we'd crack the panels and lose everything. "All right," I called gently to the hatchlings. "This isn't a competition. This practice. Small breaths only." 42 pairs of eyes stared back at me. The tiny obsidian hatchling from yesterday stepped forward first. He didn't have a name yet, but he carried himself with quiet defiance. He positioned himself near the glowing panel from the previous night. "Slow," I reminded him. He inhaled deeply and exhaled a controlled ribbon of flame. The crystal flared brighter than before. The glow spread outward in thin veins across neighboring panels. A murmur rippled through the other hatchlings. Good, I nodded. See? The walls aren't eating it. They're holding it. A small pale blue hatchling edged forward next. Frost formed at the edges of her mouth before she released a cautious stream of icy mist. For a split second, I worried the frost would counteract the stored heat. Instead, the panel shifted color. Red light softened into a warm violet. Balanced. The caretaker inhaled sharply. It's stabilizing, she whispered. Encouraged, more hatchlings stepped forward. Ember-scaled, sapphire-winged, moss-green with acidic breath that sizzled lightly, but was neutralized almost instantly by the crystalline lattice. Within minutes, the entire circular chamber pulsed with blended hues, crimson, silver, gold, cobalt, merging into a steady amber radiance. I checked the portable thermal gauge at my belt. Temperature rising, not spiking, rising steadily. Keep it gentle, I reminded them as enthusiasm grew. You're warming a home, not fighting a war. A young stormbreed hatchling released a small spark of electricity by accident. The panel absorbed it with a sharp crackle, and the overhead vents hummed. Then something remarkable happened. Warm air flowed outward from the atrium's upper ducts. Not dry furnace heat, not brittle brazier smoke, living warmth. It moved through the hallways in slow waves, brushing against stone walls and seeping into nesting alcoves. In the main hall beyond, I heard soft, surprised chirps. One of the smallest hatchlings, barely weeks old, let out a tiny, delighted squeak. Mara covered her mouth. It's reaching the nursery, she said, voice trembling. I allowed myself one slow breath of relief. We're not done, I cautioned. The system needs to stabilize long-term. For 2 hours, the hatchlings practiced measured breaths. I rotated them in shifts to prevent exhaustion. The geothermal baseline fed continuously into the chamber, and the crystals stored the blended output efficiently. The temperature in the orphanage climbed from near freezing to merely cold, then to comfortable. For the first time since I'd arrived, frost began melting from the high windows. Sunlight filtered through clearer glass, and the silence that had haunted the halls was replaced by noise, normal, chaotic, joyful dragon noise, chirping, arguing, playful wing slaps, life. I was recalibrating the lower duct valves when the alarm started. Not internal alarms, external ones. A sharp metallic bell echoed through the orphanage towers. Mara stiffened. Inspection. Already, I muttered. Whenever something improves here, she said bitterly, someone wants to know why. Through the tall windows, I saw official carriages approaching the front gate, emblazoned with the crest of the Capital Resource Authority. The same council that had labeled furnace repairs non-essential. Perfect timing. The hatchlings sensed the tension immediately. The glow in the atrium flickered as several stopped breathing into the panels. Don't stop, I called gently. You're doing great. The doors to the main hall opened moments later. 3 officials entered, wrapped in expensive fur-lined cloaks. Behind them trailed 2 guards who looked deeply uncomfortable standing inside a dragon orphanage. The lead official surveyed the hall. The frost was gone. The braziers were extinguished. The air was warm. How? He asked coldly. Is this facility operational? Mara stepped forward. We implemented a thermal redistribution system. With what funding? He snapped. I wiped grease from my hands and approached calmly. With existing infrastructure, I said, and cooperation. He glanced toward the atrium, where colored light flickered against the stone walls. His expression darkened. You are using the hatchlings as energy sources. I am teaching them control, I corrected evenly. The system stores excess output that would otherwise be wasted. It reduces strain on your geothermal grid. He hesitated at that. Reduces strain? By approximately 30%, I replied without missing a beat. Your own reports flagged winter energy deficits across the northern ring. This solution stabilizes both the orphanage and surrounding districts. That wasn't entirely proven yet, but it would be. He studied me carefully. And if the children overexert themselves? They won't, I said firmly, because I designed safeguards. As if on cue, the atrium glow shifted slightly, automated limiters engaging to dim panel intake once optimal saturation was reached. The officials exchanged glances. In the nursery wing, a young hatchling laughed. Actually laughed. As she stretched warm wings for the first time in days. The sound echoed down the corridor. The lead official's expression softened despite himself. "You've altered council property without authorization," he said finally. "Yes," I agreed calmly. A long silence followed. Then, unexpectedly, "Submit your schematics," he said. "If this reduces grid burden as claimed, it may be adapted elsewhere." Mara's grip tightened on my sleeve. After they left, the hatchlings slowly gathered around me again. The tiny obsidian one approached last. He looked up at me, golden eyes steady. Then he leaned forward and pressed his forehead lightly against my knee. Not for warmth, for trust. I swallowed hard. The dragon orphanage was no longer freezing. It was breathing. And this time, no one was going to let it go cold again. By the end of the week, the cold keep was no longer a name whispered with pity. It was glowing. Not metaphorically, literally. At night, the upper windows of the dragon orphanage shone with a steady amber radiance that pulsed softly like a living heartbeat. The thermal atrium had become the heart of the entire structure, storing and redistributing balanced energy through the crystal lattice and stone ducts exactly as I'd hoped. Maybe better. The hatchlings had turned it into a ritual. Morning sessions were for younger ones, gentle breath practice, learning control, feeding the panels small bursts of heat or frost. Afternoons belonged to older hatchlings, refining output strength and balance. By evening, the atrium walls hummed with stored warmth, enough to keep the orphanage comfortable through the coldest hours of the night. For the first time in years, no one huddled together out of desperation. They huddled because they wanted to, but success attracts attention. And attention in the capital always comes with strings. I was recalibrating a secondary vent when Mara approached, her face tight. "They're coming back," she said quietly. "Inspection round 2? I asked. She shook her head. "Higher." Through the tall tower windows, I saw a sleek black transport descending into the courtyard. Not a resource carriage this time. Imperial crest. My stomach tightened. Why would the Empire care about an orphanage furnace? I muttered. "Because," Mara said softly, "dragons are not just children, they're political symbols." The transport landed with precise grace. Moments later, the main doors opened, and a small entourage entered the hall. At their center walked a tall woman in a dark, tailored coat lined with crimson thread. She carried no visible weapon, but the guards around her radiated lethal efficiency. Her eyes swept the hall once, and lingered on the warm stone walls. "So," she said smoothly, "this is the miracle." No one answered. I stepped forward. "Depends who's asking." Her gaze shifted to me, assessing, calculating. "Minister Ilara Vance," she said. "Imperial infrastructure and strategic assets." Strategic assets. That was how they saw them. "I'm Daniel Mercer," I replied evenly. "Engineer." She glanced toward the atrium, where colored light flickered in slow, steady rhythms. "I've reviewed the Council's preliminary reports," she said. "A self-sustaining thermal redistribution system powered in part by juvenile dragon output. That's the simplified version. And the accurate one? It's not powered by them," I corrected. "It's stabilized with them." Her eyebrow arched slightly. "Show me." We walked into the atrium together. 42 hatchlings paused mid-session as the entourage entered. Some instinctively shifted closer to the walls. Others flared wings defensively. The tiny obsidian hatchling, who had practically appointed himself unofficial leader, stepped forward first. He positioned himself between the minister and the younger dragons. Ilara noticed. "Protective," she murmured. "He's observant," I replied. I gestured toward the crystal panels. Geothermal baseline feeds into the lower conduits. The hatchlings practice controlled output into the panels. The lattice harmonizes conflicting elements, fire, frost, storm, and stores the energy as balanced thermal mass. As if demonstrating on cue, a young frost breed released a careful stream of icy mist. A nearby ember breed added a ribbon of flame. The panel absorbed both, shifting into warm amber. The minister stepped closer, examining the glow. "And if they refuse?" she asked quietly. "They won't. That isn't an answer." "It is," I said firmly, "because this isn't extraction. It's participation." She turned to face me fully now. "You realize," she said, voice lowering, "that similar systems could be implemented across military installations. Dragon hatchlings trained from infancy to stabilize energy grids. Reduced dependency on volatile resources. Enhanced control." There it was. Control. "They're children," I said flatly. "They're dragons," she countered. "Powerful ones." The obsidian hatchling released a low growl. Guards tensed instantly. I stepped forward, placing a steady hand lightly on his head. "He's not a battery," I said quietly but firmly. "None of them are." Alara studied the interaction carefully. The hatchling didn't flinch from my touch. Didn't snap. Trusted. The minister's expression shifted, just slightly. "What happens?" she asked. "When they leave this place?" "They'll know control," I answered. "They'll understand balance. They won't fear their own strength." "And loyalty?" she asked pointedly. "To those who respect them," I replied without hesitation. Silence stretched between us. Behind her composed exterior, I could see the calculations running. The Empire had lost influence among dragon territories over the past decade. Too many forced integrations. Too many strategic partnerships that felt more like chains. This orphanage was different. Here, dragons weren't being weaponized. They were being empowered. The minister turned slowly, taking in the glowing chamber, the relaxed posture of hatchlings who were no longer shivering, the steady warmth radiating outward. "How much would it cost?" she asked at last. "To replicate this system?" Mara inhaled sharply. I met Alara's gaze. "Monetarily?" I asked. "Yes. Less than maintaining a single winter military campaign." She almost smiled at that. "And politically?" I didn't hesitate. "It would require recognizing dragon facilities as community partners instead of assets." That struck deeper than she expected. She was silent for a long moment. Then she stepped back. "Submit full schematics to my office," she said, "with modifications for scalability." My pulse quickened cautiously. "And the orphanage?" Mara asked carefully. Alara looked toward the youngest hatchlings, who were now playing in a patch of sun-warmed stone near the window. "It remains autonomous," she said. For now. Not a promise, but not a threat either." As the entourage exited the hall, the tension eased gradually. Hatchlings resumed their breathing exercises. The panels glowed brighter again. The obsidian hatchling looked up at me. Then, surprisingly, he trotted toward the center of the chamber. He inhaled deeply and released a stronger stream of flame than I'd seen from him before. The panel flared brilliant gold. Warmth surged outward through the ducts. Confidence. Growth. Choice. I knelt beside him. "You're not just warming a building," I murmured softly. "You're changing how they see you." He huffed lightly, smoke curling upward in a satisfied spiral. Outside, snow continued to fall across the capital. But inside the dragon orphanage, the cold keep no longer felt forgotten. Felt important. And for the first time, the future didn't look like survival. It looked like possibility. Winter did not loosen its grip easily. 2 weeks after Minister Vance's visit, the northern storms intensified. Snow buried the lower districts of the capital, trade routes slowed, and energy demand across the imperial grid spiked beyond projected limits. And then, exactly as I feared, the outer ring lost power. It started with a flicker in the atrium lights. Not the crystal panels, the city grid. The backup geothermal feed continued humming steadily, but the auxiliary systems tied to the capital's infrastructure went dark one sector at a time. Through the high windows of the orphanage, we could see neighboring buildings dimming into cold silhouettes. Within minutes, a messenger hawk drone arrived at the main tower balcony with an emergency directive from the Capital Resource Authority. Grid collapse imminent. Northern districts at risk of total freeze within hours. Mara read the message twice. "They're asking if we can stabilize overflow?" she said, disbelief in her voice. I exhaled slowly. "They're not asking," I replied. "They're hoping." The atrium glowed steadily behind us. 42 hatchlings were in the middle of their afternoon session, panels already holding near maximum balanced capacity. The system I'd built had been designed to sustain one building, not half a district, but the architecture beneath the orphanage had something the rest of the outer ring didn't. Dragon reactive crystal channels embedded deep into the foundation. Ancient conduits once meant to connect to a broader dragon city grid centuries ago. Abandoned, dormant, until now. I looked at the thermal readouts. If we rerouted excess stored energy outward instead of cycling it internally, we could push warmth beyond these walls. It would drain the atrium reservoir rapidly, and it would require every hatchling working in coordinated rotation. Risky, exhausting, potentially dangerous if control faltered. Mara met my eyes. "Can they do it?" she asked quietly. I looked toward the hatchlings. The tiny obsidian one stood at the front again, golden eyes fixed on me. Beside him, frost breeds, storm breeds, ember and moss and silver-scaled children waited. They had grown stronger these past weeks, more confident, more precise. "They can," I said firmly, "if we trust them." I stepped into the center of the atrium and raised my voice. "Listen up." 42 heads snapped toward me. "The outer ring is freezing," I said plainly. "Families, markets, other hatchlings in private homes. They're losing heat." A ripple of uneasy chirps spread. "We can help," I continued, "but only if you stay focused. This isn't practice. This is teamwork." The obsidian hatchling stepped forward first. He released a short, determined burst of flame. Agreement. One by one, the others followed, small puffs, frost curls, sparks of controlled energy. They weren't afraid. They were ready. "All right," I said, moving toward the control console. "Shift to reserve pattern delta. Rotate in groups of 6. No overexertion." Mara began organizing them smoothly, her voice steady and practiced. I descended into the lower chamber and activated the dormant outer conduits. The crystal veins beneath the orphanage responded slowly at first, faint pulses flickering through ancient channels long unused. "Come on," I muttered, adjusting flow regulators. Above, the atrium flared brighter. Group 1 exhaled in synchronized streams, fire and frost weaving together into a balanced surge that saturated the panels fully. I opened the outer gates. The stored energy flowed outward. The entire building hummed. Through the window slits, I saw something extraordinary. Across the northern district, faint lights flickered back to life. Not electric lights, warmth signatures, steam rising from rooftops as frozen pipes thawed. The conduit network beneath the orphanage was reconnecting to neighboring structures, feeding stabilized thermal energy outward like arteries carrying lifeblood. "It's working," Mara called down from the stairwell, but then the strain hit. The panels dimmed rapidly as energy drained faster than baseline geothermal feed could replenish. "Rotate," I shouted. Group 2 stepped in immediately, releasing measured bursts. The obsidian hatchling's flame was stronger now, steady, controlled. A pale frostbreed matched him perfectly, keeping the flow balanced. The conduits pulsed brighter. Another district block lit up. But the youngest hatchlings began to wobble. Sweat, actual heat condensation, beaded along ember scales. Frost breeds shivered from internal core depletion. "Slow it," I warned. "Control first, strength second." They adjusted. Not perfectly, but enough. Outside, heavy boots thundered in the courtyard. Minister Vance arrived again, this time without ceremony. She entered the atrium just as the third rotation began. The glow illuminated her face in gold and silver. "You're feeding the outer grid," she said quietly. "Yes," I replied without looking up from the console. "Without authorization." "Correct." She watched the hatchlings carefully. None were chained. None coerced. They worked together willingly, older ones shielding younger from overheating, frostbreeds stepping in when emberbreeds needed rest. Community. Alara stepped closer to the center. "How long can they sustain this?" she asked. 2 hours at current output," I answered. "Maybe 3 if rotation remains stable. And then the geothermal baseline catches up, and the main grid stabilizes." As if summoned by the statement, a distant horn echoed through the city, the signal that emergency reserves had reactivated. The outer district lights strengthened. The orphanage panels stopped dimming. The worst had passed. One by one, the hatchlings lowered their heads, breaths softening into gentle flickers. The atrium returned to a steady amber glow. No one collapsed. No one burned out. They had done it. Mara knelt, tears shining openly now. "You saved them," she whispered. I shook my head. "They saved each other." Minister Vance stood silent for a long moment. Then she spoke not to me, but to the hatchlings. "The Empire thanks you." The tiny obsidian hatchling tilted his head. He didn't bow. He didn't roar. He simply walked to the center of the chamber and released one final, perfectly controlled ribbon of flame into the crystal panel. The wall glowed warm and steady, independent, strong. Alara watched that small act carefully. When she finally turned to leave, she paused beside me. "The proposal for replication," she said quietly. "It will move forward, under one condition." I met her gaze. "You oversee it." I blinked. "Me? You built something that doesn't exploit them," she said. "That is rare." Outside, snow still fell across the capital, but warmth now flowed beneath its streets from an orphanage once forgotten. I looked at the hatchlings, laughing, stretching warm wings, no longer shivering in silence. The cold keep was gone. In its place stood something new, a living heart, and this time no one would ever call it non-essential again.